All right, everyone, welcome back. In this video presentation, we're going to talk about the anatomy of blood vessels. On this topic, there are actually 3 lecture videos. We're going to go over blood vessel anatomy. Then in the next video, we'll cover blood vessel location. And then after that, we'll talk a bit about the special circulations. But we need to get introduced to what blood vessels are and what layers can be found making up their walls. So we know so far that the largest blood vessels can be found attaching to the heart. The aorta and the pulmonary trunk are our largest arteries, and the inferior and superior vena cava are our largest veins. It is in this presentation that we're going to elaborate on the specific structures that we can find in blood vessel walls. So to officially define arteries and veins, arteries by definition will take blood away from the heart, and veins will take blood back to the heart. Without the blood vessels, the cardiovascular system would be incomplete. I have also mentioned when covering the heart that capillaries are going to be the smallest vessels in the body. They are 1 cell layer thick, and they facilitate gas exchange between our blood and the tissues, or, depending on where the capillaries are, between the external environment and the blood. Those would be the pulmonary capillaries. Arteries taking blood away from the heart are eventually going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And as they become smaller, they are called arterioles. Arterioles are the smallest arteries that we have in our bodies, and it is the arterioles that will feed blood into the capillary beds. After blood has passed through the capillary bed, it will enter into venules, and venules are the smallest veins in the body. We want to remember that veins get larger and larger, while arteries get smaller and smaller. So it is venules that will continually merge, and then eventually, as those vessels get larger and larger, we call them veins, and veins will allow blood to go back to the heart. We will also see another distinction between arteries and veins when we look at the systemic arteries and veins and compare those to our pulmonary arteries and veins. The systemic arteries carry oxygenated blood. We often depict them in the color red, while the systemic veins will carry deoxygenated blood, and we depict those in the color blue. However, it is the pulmonary arteries and veins that carry the opposite types of blood. The pulmonary arteries will actually be stemming out from the right side of the heart, taking bad blood or deoxygenated blood away from the heart and into the pulmonary circulation to be reoxygenated. And the pulmonary veins are taking that newly oxygenated blood back to the heart. So we want to make sure that when we are discussing arteries and veins, we know whether or not we're talking about the systemic arteries and veins or the pulmonary arteries and veins. There are 3 major walls or tunics that we can find in the walls of our blood vessels. Some blood vessels will only have 1 of these walls, and others will have more. Every blood vessel's tunics will be arranged differently. But it is on this slide that we will see what is common between all blood vessels. Of course, all blood vessels, by definition, must have a lumen. There has to be a space for blood to be contained within. Otherwise, blood vessels would not be making up a closed transport system. There are 3 layers to the walls of our blood vessels that we need to be aware of. And the first is known as the tunica intima. The tunica intima is our first deepest layer. The tunica media is our muscular middle layer. And the tunica externa is our outermost connective tissue layer. Let's go over these walls from the inside out. The tunica intima is the innermost layer of all blood vessels. This is made up of a simple squamous epithelium, and we often call this the endothelium. The endothelium is 1 cell layer thick. That's what simple squamous is, 1 layer of flat and irregularly shaped cells. So it is the cells of the endothelium that make up the tunica intima that will line the inside of all of our blood vessels. And we'll actually come to find that the endothelium of the tunica intima is continuous with the innermost layer of the heart, the endocardium. The tunica intima is a very smooth layer and facilitates smooth passage of blood cells and plasma along the inside of our blood vessels. Every single blood vessel in the body will have the tunica intima. Other layers, such as the tunica media and the tunica externa, are only present in certain vessels, but every single vessel inside of the entire body will have this tunica intima layer. One way that you can remember the tunica intima being the innermost layer is that the I in intima can also stand for innermost. The next layer that we will find making up the walls of our blood vessels is a very special layer known as the tunica media. The tunica media is our muscular middle layer that we find. And I'd like to think that the M in media stands for the middle, or perhaps muscular. So specifically, there are two major components of the tunica media that we need to be aware of. The first of which is circularly arranged smooth muscle, and the second are sheets of elastic tissue. The elastic tissue in the tunica media help our blood vessels deal with the increased pressures inside of our vascular system. Elastic tissue is necessary to help the vessel walls stretch due to the increased volumes of blood that are being pumped into the vessels. But smooth muscle is also a major player in the homeostasis of our cardiovascular system. Smooth muscle in the tunica media is circularly arranged, and this is a very, very big statement. Circularly arranged muscles can be described as wrapping around the vessels just as a ring wraps around your finger. The sympathetic nervous system and our vasomotor center of the medulla oblongata are two areas of our nervous system that are going to control the contraction and relaxation of the circularly arranged muscles in this tunica media. I've just drawn this little picture up here to demonstrate the concepts of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. When circularly arranged smooth muscles constrict, we must remember that that's just referring to a shortening of their length. When those muscles decrease their overall length, they're going to look something more like this. And when those muscles relax, they're going to open up those vessels. This is demonstrating the concept of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Vasoconstriction is when the smooth muscles in the walls of our blood vessels will constrict and shorten in length. This narrows the lumen of our blood vessels and increases the vascular resistance of blood going through those vessels. Vasodilation is just the opposite. Vasodilation is when we relax those circularly arranged smooth muscles to open up the lumen of our blood vessel and to allow more blood flow with less resistance to go to particular areas. So it is the tunica media that facilitates and controls vasoconstriction and vasodilation with the circularly arranged smooth muscles. The fact that these are circularly arranged give these muscle cells the ability to close the lumen. We do have another muscle arrangement known as longitudinally arranged muscles. Those will be found in the digestive system and shorten the overall length of a particular tube. We will not have those longitudinally arranged muscles here in the blood vessels. These are strictly circularly arranged so that we can regulate how much flow is going to which particular parts of the body. The outermost layer of our blood vessels is known as the tunica externa. And it is this layer that is primarily a connective tissue layer that contains various cells and lots of collagen fibers. It is the tunica externa that keeps our vessels in place. We would not want our vessels moving around throughout the body. We want them to stay where they're supposed to be. So the tunica externa will be especially important for anchoring our vessels to where they're supposed to be and also providing one extra layer of protection to our vessels on the outer side. We can remember that the tunica externa, out of all of the layers, is the most external layer. So the tunica intima is our innermost layer, the tunica media is our middle layer, and the tunica externa is our most external layer. As I mentioned before, the tunics are arranged differently in different types of vessels. Arteries will have all three, the tunica intima, the tunica media, and the tunica externa, and so will veins. Veins will have all three of these layers as well. But it is capillaries that will only in fact contain the tunica intima. The capillaries will not have the tunica media or the tunica externa at all. Those layers are too thick and they would not allow gas exchange in the capillaries. So what we will see is that even though arteries and veins will each have these three layers, the arrangement of the tunica media is different in the arteries versus the veins. Arteries are going to have a very thick tunica media, while veins have a very thin tunica media. The difference in the thickness between the tunica media of the arteries and veins accounts for the different pressures we see in the arterial tree and our venous drainage. Arteries and veins, even though they have very similar walls, are going to have very different arrangements to their walls in particular. Because the arteries have a much higher pressure in them, the tunica media needs to be thicker to accommodate for the higher pressures forcing against the walls. While veins are going to have a much lower pressure, so therefore their walls can be a little bit thinner. However, since the pressure in our venous drainage is going to be much lower, veins will also have to have other structures to accommodate for that low pressure, such as valves. And that's what we see described on this slide. The thick muscular tunica media of the arteries is in place to accommodate for the increased pressures that do come from the heart. Veins are going to have much thinner walls because there's less pressure, but because of this, we'll have to have valves. The valves, just like in the heart, will prevent blood from moving backwards in the cardiovascular system. Capillaries, on the other hand, their walls are simply made up of that single layer of cells, that simple squamous epithelium. This allows for gas exchange. The arteries and veins have the tunica media and the tunica externa in the way. So therefore, gas exchange cannot be facilitated in those vessels because their walls are simply too thick. This slide will nicely demonstrate the structural differences between arteries, capillaries, and veins. Arteries in general are going to have a much thicker wall than veins will have. Arteries tend to be more circular in their shape because the wall is in fact so thick. The tunica media especially is one of the thicker layers of our arteries. And naturally, because the wall of our arteries are so big, that means that the lumen of our artery is going to be much, much smaller. And you can see the lumen here is much smaller than it is over here in the veins. Arteries will take oxygenated blood out to our body tissues and eventually flow into arterioles that will enter capillaries. And it is the capillaries that contain just a single layer of cells and a basement membrane for those cells to attach to. It is this arrangement that allows for gas exchange. Now eventually, capillaries will take blood through the venules, and venules will enter into veins. Veins are going to have a much lower pressure that is exerted on their walls. So naturally, the walls of veins will be much thinner than that of arteries, and there will be a much larger lumen. Because of this low pressure, we also have to remember that there are valves that will prevent backflow going back to the capillaries. The outermost layer of each of these vessels is the tunica externa. That's primarily a connective tissue layer. We'll have the tunica media that contains smooth muscle and elastic tissue. You can specifically see the arteries' tunica media is much, much thicker than that of the veins' tunica media. You can see how very thin this tunica media layer is. And then every single vessel will always have the tunica intima. It's the tunica intima that's going to reduce friction inside of our cardiovascular system and help to decrease overall resistance that our heart has to pump against. One other thing I do want to mention about veins is the larger lumen on the veins will accommodate for more blood being found in our venous drainage. The majority of our blood is actually found inside of the veins. Specifically, 64% of our blood is found in our veins. This allows for veins to act as a blood reservoir, and therefore, if we are hemorrhaging or losing blood from another part of the body, our veins can undergo venoconstriction and force that blood back to those areas of importance. This slide will just show you a picture of an artery versus a vein. This over here is an artery, and this here is a vein. Specifically, you can really see already the difference in the size of the wall of our arteries compared to that of the walls of the veins. Arteries' walls are going to be much, much thicker. So thick, in fact, that they do appear rather circular on their own. Veins are going to have much thinner walls, and that causes them to sort of lay flat on each other and not maintain their patency. We will still have a tunica media in our veins, but it's going to be much thinner than that of our arteries. This thick wall in the arteries is specifically there to accommodate the increased pressures that we feel in the arterial tree. The wall of the veins don't need to be so thick because the pressures over here are much, much less.